Hello and welcome back to SCS 514, a course on world religions here at Unity Institute and Seminary. I'm Reverend Dr. Jesse Tanner, and previously, uh, in the previous video, we dealt with issues of why to study religion, looked at some of the history of scholarship in religious studies, and began to form a working definition of religion, what we mean uh, by that word religion when we use it. And in this second video, we're going to be discussing the fundamental characteristics of religion. We'll also be looking at the relationship between religion and spirituality, which is a little bit of a hot button issue these days. And we'll also look at the idea of religions as answers to the human problem. And at the very end, go over some basic terminology in religious studies that will be helpful as you move through a world religions course like this one. Now, previously, I mentioned that the framework for understanding world religions in this course is the family resemblances paradigm put forth by the eminent philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein said that religions and religious experiences are so varied from one another that the word religion can't really stand for one single principle or essence or thing, but it rather refers to a collection of phenomena, a collection of traits across the spectrum of human life that show similar elements. So much like individuals within a family, religion points to many different groups of people that resemble one another or who have trends in common, but are nonetheless still distinct from one another. So it's a way of balancing similarities and differences, unity and diversity. Religions are many and varied, but we can pick out certain characteristics or patterns that most religions do show. For something to be a religion, it must show most, if not all, of these characteristics. So building on the work, especially of Ninian Smart, a great phenomenologist of religion, I've identified 7 of these characteristics. First of all, there's tradition. Religions tend to elevate the past to a high status. Not in all, but in most, the history and the tradition of one's community and system of belief and practice is of utmost importance. It connects people with where they've come from, it informs the present circumstances in many ways, and it reaches back into the past, oftentimes to help explain origins. Stories and conceptions about the beginnings of the world are often seen as full of primordial ideals and power and authority. They're seen that way by members of the group. Think of cosmogonies or creation stories in the Bible or the Vedas, for example. Or think of the prevalent value of looking to the founders of one's own denomination or faith to find wisdom and guidance. These are examples of the importance of tradition in religion, looking to the past to inform the present as we move into the future. Then, secondly, there's myth and symbol. Religions are full of myths and symbols. In fact, a lot of people have called myth and symbol the language of religion itself. In common parlance, myth usually means false. When people go around talking about myths today, in the media or in movies or in the newspaper, usually that means a falsehood or something like that. But the way that we use it more technically in religious studies, myth means a story or a narrative that explains something meaningful, valuable, or truthful for those people who believe it. Myths describe oftentimes how the world began, how a religion came to be, why things are the way they are, what happens at death, and sort of the reality that's beyond this one. Myths are stories that help a group of people understand themselves better. It helps a group of people find a sense of identity and create a system of values for themselves to live by. Think of the Noah flood story in the Bible. Think of the Buddha's birth and temptation narratives in the Pali canon, in the Buddhist scriptures. Or the dance of Shiva upholding the universe through play, or lila. These myths all function to shape meaning and value for those people who embrace them. There are even modern myths today, right? A lot of people don't think of that, but think of actual people like George Washington and the cherry tree. Now, that event didn't actually happen, but we oftentimes tell it to our children in one way or another in order to convey a certain moral lesson. Think of Star Wars and Superman. These are modern myths. They do oftentimes create a lot of meaning for people and shape a certain worldview for those who like those mythologies. And these aren't empirical, factual accounts of reality. Myths are instead narratives that help create some sense of meaning for people and point to some truths about the world in which we live. A symbol related to myth is an object, an image, a sound, a word, a gesture, even a person that represents or stands for something other and more than itself. Especially in religion, symbols are used to represent realities that either can't be perceived normally, only experienced, and which defy or go beyond usual language. In religion, symbols are the language of myth. Myths will use symbols to try to point people to meanings that can't be expressed in normal everyday ways. And symbols often represent what is felt to be the central reality involved in a particular religion. So they're very important, and we see an endurance of myths and symbols. They last a long time. They're passed on from generation to generation because they work. They're meaningful. They create value and shape understanding. So there are countless examples of religious symbols. We could go on and on and on about different symbols and what they mean. Think of the cross, or the fish, or the Star of David, or the half-moon crescent and star in Islam. Think of the wheel of Dharma in Buddhism. Each symbol is pregnant with meaning possibilities, and each symbol points beyond itself to what is meaningful for the people who adhere to those symbols. So myth and symbol. Thirdly, third characteristic of religion is concepts of salvation or liberation. This is also referred to by a technical term, soteriology. At the most fundamental level, all religions are unique ways of saving or liberating people at one level or another, conceived, articulated, lived out in different ways. And there are always two aspects to this process of salvation or liberation, two sides to the same coin, if you will. There's on the one hand what people are to be saved from, and then what they're to be saved into or liberated into. But this transformation varies from religion to religion. At the basic level, salvation or liberation is understood as occurring in the realm of physical dangers and goods. People seek to be saved from starvation and disease, saved from natural disasters, wild animals, and enemies. They seek to be saved into plenty of food and shelter and provision, freedom from danger and disease, brought into fertility or something like that. So there's this liberation from something and being liberated into something else. This implies also a salvation from mysterious or evil powers, oftentimes. These concerns seem to be a primary reason why religion developed in the first place. At a sort of deeper level, salvation includes inner values, higher states of mind, uh, notions of individual survival of death, belief in an afterlife of some kind, and that's usually prevalent in most religious systems. This emphasis on the inner life is the type of salvation cultivated in the great living religions in the world today. Their doctrines, texts, practices, and organizations all seem to aim at cultivating this inner life of prayer, of faith, of enlightenment, of good moral character, things like that. So, salvation or liberation in religions is the process by which the religious practitioner is delivered from human problems and important needs and desires are preserved or fulfilled. Fourthly, there are sacred places. Religions deal with sacred places. A common theme in religions is this presence of sort of special, important locations or structures that are set apart from ordinary common space. What are some examples of this? Well, there are churches and mosques, synagogues and temples, shrines and pagodas, altars, meditation halls, even rocks and trees and mountains and rivers are often deemed sacred places in religious traditions. Often it's important within most religions that before entering the sacred place or sacred space, certain special actions are required, like the removal of shoes, or certain prayers and incantations to be recited, certain prostrations like bowing or kneeling, sometimes silence or fasting beforehand, special clothes or garb to be worn before entering. Sometimes there are even levels or gradations of sacred importance in sacred space itself. For example, the Jerusalem temple, before it was destroyed in the year 70 CE, that when that was standing, there were different levels of sacrality as you go inwards towards the Holy of Holies. And in many sacramental churches today, like Catholic churches or Eastern Orthodox churches, the altar that has the bread and wine for the Eucharist is the center of worship. And in Protestant churches, the pulpit or the Bible is oftentimes placed in the center, or if not spatially, then conceptually. In Buddhist temples, there's oftentimes a large Buddha image and altar in the rear, and that has a heightened sense of reverence to it. So, why might sacred places be considered special or unique? And that's because something special or unique happened there. They're revered oftentimes because they offer the possibility of directly encountering and experiencing the divine or the sacred or the transcendent reality. Transcendent is a reality that exists beyond the normal everyday life or experience. Something significant happened at sacred places oftentimes that's associated with that transcendent reality. And so when you go there, when the practitioner goes there, they can share in that meaning and value and importance that's associated with that sacred space. So when you go to a sacred space, you participate in that sacrality, in that divinity. Fifthly, a fifth characteristic is sacred actions. Sacred actions are also referred to as rituals or practices. A ritual is a special action performed in an orderly way by religious practitioners that really helps them come into closer contact with each other and with the divine or the sacred, or with that transcendent reality. Forms of ritual would be like chanting or bowing, kneeling, saying prayers, dancing, playing music, meditation, ritual tithing or getting collections, even animal sacrifices. All those would all fall under this realm of sacred practices or um, sacred actions. There are important features of ritual that I would like to mention, and the first is order. Um, Rituals have an established pattern of action. It's not random or unintentional movements. It's not often improvised, even though sometimes improvisation can be part of an orderly ritual. And it's oftentimes done in a community setting or under the direction of a leader. And besides order, there's also precision with rituals. Religious practices are understood by those who do them to require a great amount of care, a great amount of exactness or accuracy when performed. Much like scientific experiments, success usually depends on following a certain formula or a certain method that's seen as tried and true. The results will be unfavorable if the ritual is performed poorly. That's very common in religions. And besides order and precision, there's also a kind of uniformity. That is, rituals are often done in the same way, at the same kind of place, and during a special set time of year or a time period. And this gives the practitioner a sense of familiarity and safety, and also a connection with the identity of a group or a community. And so rituals and practices help people to better understand who they are and what community they're a part of. Now, sixthly, is sacred community. Uh, every religion that I've encountered uh, across the board has some social or communal structure to it. Because as humans, we're social beings. And so this is the group of people who share the same tradition or heritage or belief system, same ritual order. We as humans need that cultural connection, that societal part of our lives, to have that connection, to participate with others. So in the part of human life that deals with religion, it's really no different. Community, shared experience, a sense of togetherness or connectedness are critically important. Without that aspect of community, the religious person would feel alone or solitary in the world, and in many ways lacking meaning about that which transcends himself or herself. The religious community allows believers to share their experience of the divine and the sacred, and to find mutual support, a sense of unity and relationship in their lives. So we can't discount that importance of sacred community. A seventh characteristic of religion is sacred experience. What I mean by sacred experience is special experiences that can occur both individually as well as in a group, and that range from very frequent everyday experiences that people would encounter in their normal practices, but also to those that are more rare and unique, oftentimes called mystical experiences. Let me say a word about that. Mystical experience, also known as mysticism, is direct, immediate encounter with divine reality or with the transcendent or spiritual truth or God. And that immediate encounter results in the experience of union or connection or even a sense of a contentment that, everything's ultimately going to be all right. And so this type of experience exists in one form or another in all the religions that we'll be studying in this course, whether it's being absorbed by God's infinite light in Judaism, or liberation from a life of rebirth in the Indian religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism. It could be becoming one with the universe, like in Chinese religion, or union with God, or union with Jesus Christ, as we find in Christianity. But mystical experiences are usually felt less often. The most common types of sacred experience are in the form of a sense of awe or wonder in the presence of sacred places or within sacred community or with sacred objects, feeling love, humility, or peace or joy when performing rituals, or having a strong sense of assurance that prayers have been or will be answered. So these are the 7 basic characteristics or family resemblances that we can find in what we call religion. Tradition, myth and symbol, concepts of salvation or liberation, sacred places, sacred actions or rituals, sacred community, and sacred experience. Now, in our current United States American context, there is a growing trend in terms of how people identify themselves. I've been speaking here about religion, religions, and the religious, but I haven't really said a word about spirituality and the spiritual. In popular culture today, increasingly, the word religion is sort of being ousted, sort of being replaced by spirituality. In books and essays, on websites and social media and television, and even in places of belief and practices, people are starting to talk more about spirituality than religion. So we have a tension here. We have the new and growing self-identity category of what people call themselves. And this is oftentimes called spiritual but not religious. People will say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And so this term is used to self-identify a life stance that downplays or even in more extreme circumstances outrightly rejects traditional organized religion as the most valuable means of furthering one's growth and transformation. Now, the term exists worldwide, spiritual but not religious, but it's most prominent in the United States, where one study reports as many as 33% of people identify that way, as spiritual but not religious. But other surveys report way lower percentages, ranging from 24% to even 10% of people calling themselves SBNR, spiritual but not religious. So those who identify as SBNR, they vary in their individual spiritual philosophies and practices and theological references. But most do express belief in some type of higher power, some type of divinity, sacredness, or God, and they still engage in contemplative and other practices. But what distinguishes them is that they normally don't belong to or attend a religious affiliation or organization like a synagogue or a mosque or a church or a temple or a spiritual center. There is a tendency to be critical and sometimes even hostile, though that's not prevalent, but at least critical towards organized religion. But on my view, often the identity of spiritual but not religious reveals more about the person's distaste of organized religion than it does about the categories of religion and spirituality. So this needs a little bit of fleshing out. Historically, the words religion or religious versus spirituality and spiritual, these have been used synonymously and interchangeably to describe all the various aspects of the concept of religion. But gradually, the word spiritual came to be associated with the private realm of thought and experience, whereas the word religious came to be connected with the public realm of participation in an institution that embraces certain teachings. And so this is all a very new area of critical inquiry, but I want to give my own perspective for what it's worth, because it will oftentimes be assumed throughout this course concerning the distinction and the relationship between religion and spirituality. So we've already formulated a working definition of religion. Remember, the attempt to create order and meaning in individual and communal life through culturally perceived ultimate priorities. And we can develop an informed and analytical definition of spirituality based on a very helpful work by a scholar named George Saint Laurent. And he defines spirituality as this: spirituality designates the inner meaning of human experience under the influence of a guiding and humane worldview. Let me repeat that. Spirituality designates the inner meaning of human experience under the influence of a guiding and humane worldview. Spirituality and the spiritual are about the interpersonal meaning that we each create as individuals, and which is shaped and guided by a worldview or a belief system that is humane. And what we mean by humane is simply humanitarian or concerned with bettering humanity somehow. Spirituality isn't something we normally associate with being degrading or destructive of human life, but rather creative, constructive, and positive. But notice that this definition of spirituality isn't contrary or antithetical to religion. It's complementary in many ways. It's more of a subset or a subcategory of religion. Spirituality is part and parcel of what religion is about, because it's the process that individuals go through when making meaning and finding truth. It's the way in which people take all of the characteristics of religion that we mentioned before, and all of those elements that constitute religion, like myth and symbol, texts and places, community and rituals, and they internally make some sense out of it, out of this religious framework, and sort of live it out on a day-to-day basis. So spirituality is that individual personal synthesis and living out or demonstration of religion, or these religious characteristics, these family resemblances. Now, some people might take issue with me viewing spirituality that way, viewing spirituality as a subcategory within religion. This might disallow spirituality for those without explicit organized religious affiliation. But remember, religion isn't centrally or primarily defined as the institutional or doctrinal aspects, or any one particular aspect. In a family resemblances model, it's a network. It's a family of characteristics type of thing. And so the organized part of religion, or the doctrinal aspects of religion, are one or two characteristics among many others that form a matrix of the religious dimension of human life. So this means that even people who aren't tied to establishments, or who aren't tied to doctrines, are religious. They're religious in the sense that they still engage in many of the elements of religion, even if not all of them. And they might not be a part of a church or a synagogue, but they probably still regularly participate in some type of community, some type of interpersonal connection and relationships that supports them on their journey, like a study group, like a yoga class, like friendship circles. They probably still go to certain places that they find to be moving or inspirational, and view certain objects as significant and meaningful. And they likely still hold conceptions of what the sacred is and what the aim or purpose of life is all about. And many of those are likely grounded in many of the doctrines and teachings of the great world religions. And these are all particular characteristics of what we're calling religion, but religion is always interpreted and expressed in a personal way by individual people. That individual interpretation and personal expression of these characteristics of religion, that's what I'm calling spirituality. Now, there are many ways of conceiving how religion and religions function in human existence. And so some people see religion as an elaborate way of dealing with the anxieties of mortality or death or eventual non-existence, while others see religion functioning as a sort of practical way of passing on values and instilling morality in societies. But one framework or one conception that's been very influential and which I find rather convincing and helpful is understanding religions as answers or responses that address a basic human problem. Uh, they're sort of answers or responses to like a fundamental dilemma that's conceived and experienced. And in his introduction to the book God is Not One, Stephen Prothero uses this kind of paradigm to introduce world religions. That is, religions provide a coherent framework for making meaning about the whole of reality, where human individuals and communities may come to terms with the fundamental predicament in human existence. They are sort of holistic systems of belief, of teaching and values and practices that creatively deal with the difficulties and the obstacles that are experienced in humanity across time and place. In other words, religion arose because of the universally felt sense that something's wrong with the world and with humanity. Something's amiss. Something's a little off. And so religions address that offness, that sense that something is wrong. And they foster the possibility and the opportunity for correcting that wrong, mending those wounds, or experiencing liberation from the human problem and dilemma. So I've developed what I call a categorical framework that helps to better understand this process of creative transformation found in religious traditions. That is, religions show three components of a progression towards an ultimate goal in human life. Now, each religion has its own particular way of seeing and communicating and articulating these components. But every religion has these three components present in their system in some way, shape, or form. Now, first of all, religions point out that there is a basic human problem. This is the idea that there's something in human existence that's awry. Something's amiss, something's askew. And this problem, however it's conceived, it causes dissatisfaction. It causes unwanted suffering in life. And it gets in the way of experiencing life in its fullness. Secondly, religions provide a practical means by which people can grasp, address, and answer this fundamental human problem. And it allows them to go on a path of transformation. Practical means can be anything that cultivates a response to the basic dilemma, that people sort of live this out, they enact it in their lives. Things like rituals and contemplative practices, things like liturgical formulas, scriptural study, and even doctrines and theology, when they are used to support the transformation process, can be considered practical means. Religions claim that there's an ultimate aim or goal. So this is the third component, that there's an ultimate aim or goal that people are moving towards, and which is the liberating experience of overcoming that experienced human problem. The ultimate goal is what beliefs, teachings, values, and practices are all centered on. It's what everything comes together to move towards that ultimate goal. And so when you reach this goal or this aim, then there's the experience of ultimate transformation, liberation from that basic human problem into that ultimate goal, or summum bonum of human life. Now, this sort of threefold model serves as a way to interpret and explain the kind of transformation that each religion cultivates for people, and that constitutes the nature and purpose of religions in the first place. So this transformative element from the human problem to the ultimate goal of liberation from that problem it's fundamentally soteriological. Remember that word soteriology, which has to do with salvation. But let me qualify first what I mean by salvation. Um, Etymologically, the Greek word soteria, where we get that fancy word soteriology from, is rendered salus in Latin. And salus comes into English as salve, like you would put on a wound, and forms the word salvation. So fundamentally, these roots convey a meaning connected to healing, connected to a process of coming to well-being or wholeness. So we can reasonably understand salvation as dealing with what constitutes uh, the experience of healing, liberation, freedom, release, or emancipation from the human problem. And this pattern of salvation looks very different from religion to religion, but it's present throughout the traditions. The transformation that is salvation, indicates the progression of resolving or dissolving the basic human problem and is essentially a therapeutic development of healing or mending the dis-ease of human life as it's understood and articulated in each religious tradition. To make this a little bit more concrete, let me use two religions in particular as examples briefly. I'll use Christianity and Buddhism. In Christianity, the basic human problem or dilemma is seen as sin, or in Greek, hamartia, which did actually have its roots in archery. So to sin in ancient Greek culture was to miss the mark. So hamartia is failure to attain an aim or a goal. Now, grounded in Judaism, Christianity transformed that into a theological meaning. So sin can refer to individual thoughts and words and deeds that don't sort of line up with God's nature and purpose. But more foundationally, sin refers to a particular state of being, a kind of internal spiritual condition that humans live in, a distorted or a frustrated relationship with God. So this state of being is what accounts for us humans always making mistakes and hurting other people and hurting ourselves all the time. And I'm not talking about original sin here, where humans are born inherently corrupt and pass that on to successive generations. That's not universally held throughout Christianity and was actually a later doctrine invented essentially by Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. Now, the solution or the ultimate goal in Christianity is twofold: reconciliation and redemption. Those are the two aspects of salvation. So through faith in Jesus and participation in his life and work, Christians are reconciled into a right, harmonious relationship with God. And that's all accomplished by virtue of God's grace or love that overcomes humanity's sin, that distorted relationship. And redemption is about the liberating experience of having a new, transformed life through Jesus Christ. So God not only brings reunion and right relationship, but also what's called sanctification, giving Christians the power to actually live out that new way of being in light of their reconciliation with God. And so how does a Christian get to that ultimate aim or goal? Well, through practical means. And in Christianity, that can be summed up with the words grace, faith, and works, including moral actions and rituals. Now, different Christians put different emphasis on how these relate to one another and which one is more fundamental and how they actually come together, but it's usually some combination of those. Now, moving on to Buddhism, the human problem is expressed throughout Buddhism in the key principles of dukkha and tanha. Excuse me. And both of these are articulated in the Four Noble Truths, which we'll be learning about later in the course, which were first taught by Gautama Buddha at the Deer Park and then also in other discourses later on. But dukkha exists as the first truth, and it's been translated into English as suffering or painfulness or disharmony or unsatisfactoriness. And this term dukkha can be broken down into du, which means bad or low, and ka, which means to be empty or hollow. And some scholars posit that this originally was a reference to the hole in the center of a wheel into which the axle was placed on the chariots in ancient India. So dukkha brings this image of having an unaligned axle and wheel hole that makes the chariot kind of run bumpy and wobbly, causing disruption and discomfort. And it's kind of a metaphor for the suffering and unsatisfactoriness that we experience as humans in day-to-day life in one way or another. And all of this dukkha arises primarily from tanha, which means craving or thirst, this clamoring for things. And the ultimate goal in Buddhism it's called by a couple different names, but they're all forms of liberation. Liberation from suffering and the craving that causes suffering. Sometimes it's referred to as nirvana, which means the extinction of all that causes suffering and therefore the extinction of suffering itself. Kind of like when you blow out a candle. That's sort of the image that would come to an ancient Indian person's mind when they hear that word nirvana. It's also called enlightenment, which refers to this full experience of and understanding of reality. And not just any old reality, but reality as it truly is. And so reality as it truly is this constant, interdependent change and process, this network of change and process. So this conscious illumination allows one to get rid of all ignorance and craving and therefore become liberated from suffering or dukkha. And the practical means that Buddhists use to attain nirvana or enlightenment is actually the fourth noble truth in Buddhism, the Eightfold Path. And this is the continual self-discipline of cultivating right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And the Buddha called this path as the middle way, the Majjhima Patipada, this middle way between two extremes. On the one hand, the extreme of self-indulgence and sensual pleasure, like greed, and on the other hand, self-mortification or self-austerity. So, walking the Eightfold Noble Path leads on ultimately to salvation or to release from suffering. So these are just two examples of this understanding of how religions have a threefold process of problem, practical means, and then the ultimate goal of liberation. And before I end this lecture, I do want to mention some basic terms that may be used throughout the course in one way or another, but either way, whether or not you encounter them, they are important to know for any student of world religions. First is monotheism. Many of you may already know this term. It's the belief that there's only one God and no others. And we see this primarily in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So monotheism, one deity. Then there's polytheism. Poly meaning many, and theos meaning God. So a plurality of deities. For example, in ancient Greece, and Rome, and Egypt, they believed in many gods that pervaded the whole universe, each having a special job or a unique role to play. Like Apollo would have been the god of light and sun and truth. Hermes was the god of messages and meaning. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty, and things like that. Then there's a term called henotheism, H-E-N-O theism. This is the belief that there are many gods, like polytheism, but only one is worshipped as most important. These gods are different forms or manifestations or expressions of the one ultimate or absolute Godhead. For example, Hinduism has always held this kind of belief system where people worship particular local gods from their region or family clan, but believe that this God is just one form or function or outward presence of the ultimate God, Brahman. Brahman. And then there's pantheism. Pan in Greek means all. So this is the belief that everything is God, or all is God. This view says that God equals the universe or the world. So there's no division or distinction between the creator and that which is created. There's no distinction at all between God and the world. They are the same thing. All is identified as God's self. Then there's a more subtle position, and that's panentheism. This is a more recently developed theological position. It's panentheism, not pantheism. So we can't confuse those two. And then that little n, en, makes a huge difference in there. Panentheism means literally all in God, or all is contained within God. So it's not that everything is identical with God, but that everything is present and existing within God's self. And many panentheists would say that God is also present and existing within everything too, within every part and individual of the world. Then there's atheism. Atheism, or means like without God. When we come to atheism, we really have to make a distinction between two types. Number one, there's the belief that there is no deity or deities. It's a positive affirmation. It's a positive statement that there is no such thing as deity or deities. But then there's a second kind of atheism. There's atheism that is simply the absence of belief in a deity or deities. Not making a positive affirmation or a positive statement, just the absence of any belief or statement on the issue, without a belief in God or gods. It's always important to remember that people at different times and places in history have been called atheists, even when they believed in gods and goddesses. It has been mostly used as a label to signify certain people as the minority group because they're threatening or they're undermining to the majority in some way. A good example that I like to bring up is Christians. Christians who lived during the Roman Empire who were called oftentimes atheists by the Romans. Why would they be called atheists? Christians believe in God. Well, this is because they simply didn't believe in the gods of the empire. It's not that they didn't believe in God, because they did, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but it was that they didn't believe in the right gods, namely the gods of Rome. And then there's, lastly, agnosticism, which is the view that the existence of a deity or deities, it's unknown ultimately, or it's simply impossible to prove or disprove the existence of God or gods. It's definitely a distinct position from atheism. Agnosticism means without knowledge. A means without, and gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge or wisdom. So agnostics have say it's impossible to know for sure whether or not a God exists. So these are a few terms that may be important to become familiar with as you move forward in your reading and study in this course and beyond. And so this is the second video and the last video, perhaps at least a lengthy, significant video that I'll be making. I may post a few here and there throughout the course, maybe to clarify something or to just maybe pose a question or something like that. I may do that from time to time, but but these two videos are sort of to give an overview of religion and religious study and just some basics and foundations. So thanks so much for watching. I'm looking forward to continually interacting with every one of you during the course of this course. Peace.